I was experimenting with the glasses. I feel like they're both cute, but we're gonna do away with them for this. Hello, welcome, and I'm so excited to talk to you about the books that I read in January. I read 8 books in January. 4 of them I have physical copies of, which those are our stats, and I listened to / read via Libby 4 of the books. We had an interesting mix. I am happy with the number of books that I read. I did feel like the whole month I felt like I was in a reading slump, and I'll get into that, but for me a reading slump isn't that I completely stop reading, although that has happened to me in the past. It's more so that when I'm reading I just can't get very engaged. I have a hard time focusing with whatever I'm reading. So I did have a little bit of that experience, but I did get to finish 8 books, which I was happy about, even if it took me a little bit longer than usual, and I felt like sometimes I was dragging my feet. For most of these books, the problem was definitely the fact that I was in a reading slump and had pretty much nothing to do with the books themselves. The first book that I read, and this is early January / end of December I started them, and then I finished them in January. So the first book that I read is What It Takes to Heal by Prentice Hemphill. I picked this up as an audiobook because I was part of a book club-ish type of thing last year in the summer, and a lot of people were talking about how it was very uplifting, it was very informative, not just healing yourself but healing as part of community. I was actually on the waiting list for this for a really long time. In December, end of December, I got it in from the library, and then I decided to just kind of listen to it on and off throughout my break. I thought it was really informative. I think it was very uplifting, genuinely it made me feel a little more hopeful for the future. Always love and appreciate that. It wasn't too long and it wasn't too hard to listen to or follow along with, and it definitely left me with more hope than I started out with. Nonfiction audiobook. So then the next book that I read was Beloved by Toni Morrison. This book is about Seth. She escapes slavery, she goes to Ohio, she lives in a house with her daughter Denver, and the house is haunted literally by a ghost, and the ghost is the ghost of her baby, who's named Beloved and just has one name, Beloved. And as you're reading the story, you're learning more and more about this child, you're learning more about her past, and you're learning more about all the trauma and horror that she endured under slavery and continues to suffer from psychologically as a result, even now that she's no longer a slave. This was so tense. Not just was it tense, but it was also just so powerful and painful to read at times. And I remember genuinely as I was reading this and learning more about these characters, but also the very real experiences of people who were slaves. I thought it was such an important read, and this is also one of the books that is banned. I actually own a copy of this one, but I left it at home in England with my mom. It was really moving. It was moving, it was tense, it was just incredible. It left such a feeling and impact on me that I started researching about it, and I wanted to know more about the story and how Toni Morrison came up with it, and just kind of more of the backstory of this particular story and novel. And it turns out that it's based off of a real thing that happened in the past, where this woman, she was trying to escape slavery, and in the pursuit of preventing her children from falling into that system and falling into slavery themselves, she murders one of her children. And something that as I was reading this, something that I realized very viscerally and very with a lot of frustration was that my schooling, I grew up in Texas, and my history classes in schooling did not do enough justice teaching us about how horrific slavery was. I feel in my education personally, we did not learn enough, and this book definitely made me more aware of that, of just I'm not informed enough and I need to be. So I really highly recommend this. It's so obvious why it's a banned book, and I think the fact that it is a banned book is the reason why literally everyone should read this, whether or not you're from the US. So that is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Made me cry. made me cry. And then I picked up as an audiobook The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. This is a very short story. It's about this girl who has like she's drawn to the woods at midwinter, but like she's drawn to the woods. She can like talk to animals, she can talk to trees. She's very like unusual. It was very Christmassy, and I don't remember, like obviously I remember kind of what happens, but I remember that there was a lot that was not clear. And my only response to this after reading it was, we need a book. Like, I am hoping that Susanna Clarke is planning to make a novel out of this, because it was so interesting. The ending wasn't like wrapped up in a tiny bow. Like, you could take this places essentially. And since Susanna Clarke is the author of one of my favorite books, Piranesi, I was just like, give me more. Then we have a DNF, which I actually own a copy of, but I am planning to unhaul, and this was part of my reading vlog, which I will link as well. But I read about 50 something percent of Fish Have No Feet. This was a book that I picked up after several months, almost a year. I thought it had been a year, but I think I picked it up closer to March of 2024. And I tried to pick it up again for my January reads, and I just couldn't do it for a bunch of reasons. I talked about it to death in the reading vlog. If you're interested in this and you're interested in like what I thought about it in more depth, you can watch that. But that's Fish Have No Feet. This is a DNF, so it doesn't entirely count as like a book I read, but I'm gonna count it because I did put like 50 something percent into it. So that's Fish Have No Feet. And then the next book that I finished was A Clockwork Orange, which I listened to this as an audiobook, and I'm really glad I did. The narrator did a really good job, and it was very difficult to follow at first because it just sounded like complete gibberish at first, and it took me a minute to be like, oh, like he's using a made-up language to describe this, that, and the other. And once I kind of got better understanding of what those words meant, the story kind of fell into place for me. The main takeaways that I had from this, let me hold this better. But yeah, I think the main takeaways that I had from this book was these questions of morality, of good and evil, of who determines what's right versus wrong, of human freedom, and what people will do when they have the space to commit crimes, / what it means when you are forced to be good as opposed to choosing to be good. I mean, a question that came up while I was listening to this was this idea of, how much value is there in someone being forced to be good and being forced to be a quote-unquote good person as opposed to just being evil? And are those the same thing? Like, are those on the same tier? Because something that happens in this novel is that the main character, and you're in his head and he's explaining to you like the crimes that he's committing, which are insane, like the things he does are insane, and like what kind of lands him in prison. And once he's in prison, they are doing these like experiments to try to kind of brainwash people, and he's like one of the people that they're doing it on, they're experimenting on, to brainwash people into being good and law-abiding citizens. It was just so crazy. Like, you have this character, I think he was like a priest or something, or maybe a doctor, but he literally posed this question of, if someone is being good because they have no choice, is that like, does that have any meaning? Does that have any real value or worth? Really, really interesting book. I found it so fascinating, and I thought it was really cool how successfully the author was able to create and use an entire language for one single book. As far as I'm aware, I don't think that language is used for any of his other books. The other funny thing was that there was a foreword, and the author, Anthony Burgess, was talking about how this is like his least favorite thing he's ever written, which I thought was just hilarious because this is so popular as far as like I know. It's like a classic. And he was also talking about how there is an American version and there is a British version, and the British version has the final chapter, which I listened to the British version, but that version has like a final chapter in which the main character is kind of like redeemed, or like he chooses to quit his crimes, and it kind of comes off as like one day he's just sick and tired of being evil. The British version has that chapter, and then the American version apparently doesn't. And he was explaining something about how like Americans are less willing to accept that over time people will be less evil or something like that. I don't know, maybe I misunderstood it, but that's what I got from it, and I thought it was really crazy because like, of course they're making different versions for Americans versus British people, but this was so good. I highly recommend. I thought that it was like such an interesting analysis of like free will, morality, good versus evil, and the choice that a person makes between doing something good or being good versus doing something evil or being evil. But yeah, that's all to say, this was really great. I'm really glad that I read this. So I also read Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad. I've talked about this so much, especially in the vlog that I made, so also head over there if you want to learn more about this. And I will just also put out there that If We Were Villains was also part of that vlog. I loved these two books. They were so interesting, they were so impactful in different ways, and yeah, if you want to see my thoughts, head over to that other video. Finally, I also read Upstream by Mary Oliver. These are some selected essays that she's written, and Mary Oliver is a poet. She wrote Wild Geese and so many other beautiful poems that I absolutely love and adore. I was listening to this as an audiobook. It was so quietly moving and so quietly impactful, and the reason I say quietly is because it wasn't in your face about the things that, like, Mary Oliver, like the way she was writing, it wasn't in your face what she was trying to say exactly. Even though it was a nonfiction essay, it was just so beautiful because she was using these like anecdotes of her observations of nature, which it's very in line with her poetry, so I wasn't like surprised at all. But it was just so beautiful the way that she was writing and observing the world. And the one thing, like, I think the biggest takeaway that I left with listening to this was this idea of seeking ordinariness, or like seeking the ordinary. And I remember this because I was listening to this, and obviously very much like lots of anxiety in January, lots of stress. And I remember I was like feeling a little like on edge, and I was listening to this, and she was talking about how like you don't have to be extraordinary all the time. Your life doesn't have to be better than everything else, and like whatever. And she was explaining, I remember the example she gave was like when you are boarding a flight, like you are hoping that everything is going to be ordinary and normal. You're hoping that everything's going to go smoothly. You don't want something extraordinary or unusual to happen. And that just stuck with me. It was just, I don't know, it shifted something in me. It's like, it was very odd because like, I know these are things that you know because like by virtue of just being alive, right? These are things that like on some level you know them, but hearing that and like just digesting that was altering a little bit, because I just started having this like thought of like, oh, like you don't have to be extraordinary, like you don't have to hope your life is going to be extraordinary. And she was talking about how like her life is so beautiful being simple and being normal, going to the grocery store and watching the crows outside and watching the spider weaving its web. And it was such a beautiful, it was so beautiful. I wrote this like little excerpt of a quote: "To me, the door to the woods is the door to the temple." And I love that. And it was kind of in line with a line in The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. There's this line that says, "The woods are a kind of church." And yeah, just a lot of good feelings. My phone died, so I had to put in the charger for a little bit, and the sun's gone. But I just wanted to say thank you for watching, and thank you for being here. I hope that any of these sounded interesting. If there are any that you want to pick up, let me know. And if there are any books that you think, based off of the ones that I really liked that I read in January, that you think I should read, let me know. I look forward to seeing you guys in another video very soon. Goodbye.